Hello and welcome to Round Robin. Today's show is not exactly an interview here in the studio. We're going to bring you a panel of distinguished elected officials who were among the first in their field, at least in modern times. These are African Americans who made history, and they're going to tell you their stories.
When I thought about our 400-year commemoration and just some of the things we were planning, one of the things that hit me was the fact that when we had Reconstruction between 1866 and 1877, we had a number of Black or African-American elected officials. And I thought that was significant. And I know, as Governor Wilder said, today we look at what we have and we believe that it's almost always been that way. But actually, if we go back to that period of Reconstruction, we actually had an appointed governor, Pinchback from Louisiana. We had 3 lieutenant governors from Louisiana. We had U.S. senators and Congress members. In South Carolina, we had 316 elected officials. In fact, they think that during Reconstruction, South Carolina was either predominantly African American or at least 50%. Mississippi had some 266 elected officials. Louisiana had about 216. And in the state of Virginia, we had 170 plus. So there was great progress. But unfortunately, Black codes, voter suppression, terrorism, and a number of other things stopped that progress. And so today, what we wanted to do was to bring together some individuals who were first since Reconstruction, or the first ever, and allow them to tell their stories. And so with that, I want to bring up Mr. Rick Bagley, who's going to do some introductions of our panel, and with that, we will begin our panel. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I hate to disappoint the former governor, but I'm not going to be as brief as the first introduction. On behalf of the Board of Directors of the Downtown Hampton Business Improvement District, I'd like to thank you all for attending. I'd also like to thank Mayor Tuck for assembling this amazing group of African American men and women who broke through barriers to win elections as the first in their selected seats. Before I forget, I want to invite all of you to visit our downtown. Please walk our waterfront. The views of Hampton University across the Hampton River are special. The seafood is fresh and the drinks are cold. Please come visit us. Now for our panel. I will start with our out-of-state guest first. Lieutenant Governor Jeanine Hampton comes to us from Kentucky. Her resume is extremely impressive. Jeanine is from Detroit, Michigan. She worked in the automobile industry to help pay for college. She earned an industrial engineering degree from Wayne State and her master's in business administration from the University of Rochester. She served 7 years in the Air Force, near and dear to our heart with Langley being here. She served in Desert Storm in Saudi Arabia and was responsible for radar software used to track enemy planes and to help in search and rescue missions. 4 years ago, she was elected Lieutenant Governor of the state of Kentucky. She was the first African-American woman to hold statewide office in the state. Jeanine, thank you so much for taking your time to come and be with us today. The Honorable Harold Lee joins us from our neighboring state of North Carolina. Howard is originally from Georgia. He was the first member of his family to graduate from college. He received a degree from Fort Valley State College. He served in the U.S. Army. Howard started work as a probation officer in Savannah, Georgia, where he met and married his wife, Lillian. He earned his master's degree in social work from UNC and served on the faculties of Duke and North Carolina Central. Howard was elected twice as the mayor of Chapel Hill, becoming the first African-American mayor. Howard has served as Secretary of Natural Resources and Community Development, has served on the North Carolina State Board of Education, where he served as chairman. He was also elected and served in the Senate of North Carolina. This guy must be one hell of a politician. To leave North Carolina, work for Duke, and be elected in Chapel Hill as mayor, it is beyond me, but we're so thrilled to have you here. The Virginia contingent of our panel are people I met through my dad a long time ago. Dad was elected to the Virginia General Assembly in 1966. Doug Wilder came into the Senate in 1970. I was only 13 at the time. He stuck out, let's say. He had a sense of style that, with those codgy old men, just kind of put him in a class by himself. 7 years later, I finished Virginia Tech and started my career at Wheat First Securities in downtown Richmond, just a few blocks from the state capitol. Being the son of a delegate, I could go on the floor of the House and Senate and listen to the debates. I remember it like it was yesterday. Then Senator Wilder got up to render his view on some pending legislation. It wasn't what he said that I remembered, it was how he said it. There's a certain cadence to how he speaks. It drew you in, and then he had you. When Senator Wilder ran for governor, even though he was a long shot, I knew with his charisma he was going to win, becoming the first African-American governor in the country. It was truly a historic event. I was proud it happened in Virginia. What I didn't know about Governor Wilder is that he served in the Army in the Korean War and was awarded the Bronze Star. We're so glad you're here. Congressman Bobby Scott also served with my dad in the General Assembly. Bobby's dad was a doctor and served on the Newport News School Board. Our dads were friends. Bobby has dedicated his life to this community. First as a state delegate, then as a state senator, now as our congressman. He has worked for things like health care for children, raising the minimum wage, all causes that there are no lobbyists for. When my dad was forced to give up public service because of health reasons, Bobby spoke at one of the events that they had to honor Dad's 20 years of service. And I will always remember it. He said, "My dad could disagree with you without being disagreeable." It was a compliment that I carry in my heart. Civility in politics is a novel concept, certainly one that's way overdue. Bobby also served in the Army Reserves, went to Harvard Law. Bobby, thank you for your friendship and for being here today. Last but certainly not least is Senator Mamie Locke. Mamie started her political journey as a professor of political science at Hampton University. In 1996, she decided to throw her hat in the ring. I don't know what she was thinking. She ran and won a seat on the Hampton City Council. In 2000, she became the city's first African-American mayor. I had the opportunity to go before Mamie to solicit her support for something that a group of us believe would help the city from an economic development standpoint. She supported us, even though it wasn't a very popular political decision. The initiative has produced millions in tax revenue and supported hundreds of jobs. That's leadership. I've been a fan ever since. Mamie has gone on to serve in the state Senate for the past 15 years, and thank you, Mamie, for being here. One thing I am good at is math. I went back and added up over 150 years of public service from this group of people. The number of people and families this group must have helped along the way is incalculable. What an honor it is to be here, to introduce this distinguished group to all of you. Let's give them a big round of applause. At this point, I would like to hand the microphone over to Beverly Burke. As a journalist for 47 years, she's made a few firsts of her own. She has worked in radio and television stations in New York, Durham, Chicago, and Baltimore. Currently, she's the news director and anchor of WEAA Public Radio in Baltimore, which operates from Morgan State University, and also works as a media consultant. Beverly, it's all yours.
I want to thank you very much for having me here this afternoon. Sometimes you have to pinch yourself when you're in a place where everyone has just been in the right place at the right time with the right people. Don't you know right now that's what you're feeling? With our public service and those who stepped ahead to be whatever was needed, even before we knew we needed it. It is so important that we continue to witness this. The griots who continue to tell the story are helping us to be the new storytellers, but more important, to be active in putting yourself in that place to get the job done. I have one thing that I want to share as a reporter. When I worked in North Carolina, and that's where I met Donnie Tuck, before mayor. And I had just come from Buffalo, New York, where I was the technical director of the Buffalo football team. I was a rock and roll disc jockey, and I also did public affairs broadcasting from WKBW in Buffalo, New York. And then I came to my first story in the tobacco fields of Durham. That's when I realized I had to get my hair done, because I was still natural. But that was okay, because after I did, and I went to New York to get it done, okay? After I did, I came back, and in the opportunity to compete, to become an anchor, I was able to do that job. And then I did my own investigation of the area, of the city, of the state, of the region, and how rich it is with its people. Leaving there at the time, 3 years later, I ran into Donnie in Washington. And this was after I had taken a job in Baltimore, replacing some talk show girl by the name of Oprah Winfrey. And we had to marvel, actually, at how far we had come and who had helped us along the way and the steps that we were taking to continue telling stories that no one else would tell. And that continued for some years after that. Competition being what it was, there were some times in which you were replaced because some of the stories you told were unpopular. And this is what I would like to just remind you today, is that you have to be a truth teller. You have to tell the truth. You have to continue the story. And you also have to recruit media, okay? You have to recruit media to be responsible in the truth-telling and the storytelling. Let's get started. There are stories to be told here. How this is going to work, and I really want this to move very quickly because your attention is needed at this podium. Each of our guests will have exactly 3 minutes with, and I know this is it. I hear you, Congressman Scott. It's But the first question is about, there is something about what got you into public life and getting started. It was something that launched you. Just give us an element of that. Maybe it was published before or such, but the important thing is that we know what that is. And I'm going to begin with former Virginia Governor Douglas Wilder. Your 3 minutes.
I don't need that much time to tell you. I never wanted to be in public life. I never wanted to run for public office. I never wanted to go around smiling and grinning and begging for money and asking anybody to do anything for me. But I didn't see any representation. I didn't like much of what was out there supposedly in representation, and I was as green as, as an oyster, what some would say. I had never gone into a room to see legislation passed. I'd never seen people debate it. I knew nothing about what was taking place, but I did know people, so much so I knew that people felt they were not being represented. And so consequently, when I saw that, I didn't know that it would be like quicksand, and that each step you take further steps. So I got in it for one purpose only, and that was to provide a voice for people that I felt didn't have one, to give strength to people that I felt didn't sometimes show it, and I wanted to be them. And I've also learned that the greatest advisors you can ever have are the people, and I continued to listen to them, and I listen to them today.
Thank you very much. A story that I already am privy to is one I really want you to lean in for, because it takes us back to a moment when, in our youth, we found out we were in the world. State Senator and former Mayor Mamie Locke.
Each of us have those defining moments in our life when we are compelled to act. For me, that happened when I was a 15-year-old in high school, when the National Guard rolled onto the campus of Jackson State University and shot up a female dorm. And in their shooting up that dorm, they killed a 17-year-old student whose only crime was walking home from work. And the next day, several of us in school decided that we were going to walk out. And our principal said, no, you cannot do that. And I had a decision to make as a 15-year-old bookworm. Either you're going to do what your principal says, or you're going to walk out. And my decision at that time was to walk out. And that was the point at which my community activism was ignited. And from that point on, it wasn't that I was bucking the system. It was that the National Guard rolled onto a campus because students were deciding that they wanted to protest the Vietnam War. I had had 3 brothers in Vietnam, 2 of whom were injured severely. So either I was going to sit at home and do nothing, or I was going to act. It was my decision to act. And it was from that point on that I decided that I had to be involved. And it was reinforced 2 years later when I decided to go to an activist undergraduate school, which was Tougaloo College, which had been very involved in the civil rights movement, and met 2 of my sheroes, Alice Walker and Fannie Lou Hamer.
Oh. Thank you very much. And next, former state senator and former mayor Howard Lee. The same question, what launched you?
When I was testing, when I was 15 years old, I became very disgusted with the condition of restrooms for black folk in my hometown. So I decided on that occasion to check out the white male's bathroom. And I used it, but then I got carried away and decided I wanted to see what it looked like in the white female's bathroom. And I ended up being accosted by a group of Klansmen who roughed me up and I was able to get away, because the one thing I learned when I was growing up in the South is you better learn how to run fast. And that went away, and then when I was stationed at Fort Hood, Texas, I wrote a letter to the President of the United States, President Eisenhower, complaining about my assignment. I wanted it changed. And of course, amazingly enough, 6 weeks later, a letter came back from the President to my commanding officer demanding that my assignment be changed, and I was put on another assignment. That gave me an indication of the power of politics. And then in 1966, my wife and I came to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, after I'd completed my master's degree and decided to buy a house in the white community. And we were repelled by the realtors. No one would even show or sell us a house, but we finally prevailed, bought the house, and then lived under threat of death for the next year. It was that experience that said to me, change had to come even in liberal Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And so I launched my campaign as mayor, never expecting to win, but expecting to force my opponent into committing to doing the things I would do if I were mayor, and he agreed to everything. And I had this long list of things that should be done that I would accomplish if I was mayor, and lo and behold, that night I was elected. And so all of a sudden, all the great things that I had promised to do, I was on my way to try to get them done, and I remember the last words I said to my wife before we went home is, now that I got it, what the heck am I going to do with it?
Thank you very much. And next, 3 minutes. This is a very interesting story. Lieutenant Governor Janine Hampton, what launched you?
Well, like Governor Wilder, I never ever intended to run for any office, especially after watching politicians and politics both in Washington and in Kentucky. And it's dysfunctional. There's the only word I can think of it. And I'm from the private sector. I've worked in a plant. I know in a plant, if you don't do things right, you miss orders, and eventually you're out of business. I've often said that if politicians ran my box plant, they'd miss every order, they'd argue with the customers, and then they'd bill them anyway. And just completely dysfunctional. So the way I got into politics, though, it's a God story. This is what happens when you start praying for guidance. I gave my life to Jesus Christ in 2011 and decided I would walk with Christ thereafter. And when I turned to him for guidance, I got an unexpected answer for my career, and it was run for office. And I want to tell you, I ignored that for months. I ignored that guidance, but it got so big that I finally, in 2014, acquiesced and ran for the Kentucky State House unsuccessfully. But before that, I had jumped into the Tea Party movement, which I loved. It's We the People, and I love that movement. And we were just ordinary people who decided that we had a say in government, as every American citizen does, and we were going to get involved. And so we started looking at Washington, looking at Frankfurt, which is our capital. I was calling my representatives to talk about bills and policies just so I could take it back to my Tea Party group in Bowling Green. And meanwhile, we decided we were going to vet candidates one year, and one of the people that I vetted was the guy who is now our governor. And that's how we met. That's how he ended up tapping me to be his running mate. But frankly, if you had told me on the night that I lost my House race in November 2015 that 1 year from that date I'd be elected lieutenant governor, I would have told you were nuts, completely nuts. There was no path forward that I could see that, but we made it happen. God made that happen. There's no way around it. We won a four-way primary by 83 votes, only 83 votes. So don't let anybody tell you your vote doesn't count, because it does.
And that story we will continue in just a moment with another question. But to wind out our launch, we go to the Congressman, Bobby Scott.
Thank you, Ms. Burke. I guess the thing that got me involved in politics is that I got frustrated with trying to get things done. When I first ran for the House of Delegates in '77, I was the sitting president of the Newport News branch of the NAACP, and we had a lot of things on our agenda, and we just weren't making any progress on it. And the one thing that really, I think, got me animated was there was a judicial vacancy in the juvenile court in Hampton, and we lobbied the Hampton delegation. And I remember talking to one member of the Hampton delegation, Rick, it wasn't your father, another member of the Hampton delegation, and you just got the sense that he wasn't taking this candidate seriously. I mean, just kind of dismissive. And I said, well, if they're not going to do right, then me pick the judges, and I just up and ran for the House of Delegates. I did not know then that I didn't have any chance of winning. I wasn't burdened with that wisdom. And so I just jumped out there and ran, and in a top 3 win situation, ended up in first place. And after that, we could pick my own judges. But there's also an interest in trying to get things substantively done in politics, in education, criminal justice system, healthcare. There are a lot of things that needed to be done, and I just didn't get the sense that people were focused on those issues. And one of the, I guess, most frustrating things of being in politics is the fact that most people are interested in the rhetoric of politics and not that interested in actually getting something substantively done. And if you've been watching the federal spectacle, trying to focus on, you think of all the headlines you've seen in the last 3 or 6 months, how many times have you seen the Higher Education Act mentioned, or minimum wage mentioned, or something, healthcare, something substantive? All you hear about is the spectacle and the name calling, and trying to keep focused on the substance has been extremely difficult.
Thank you very much. We have heard in some of these stories some of the strategies that were used, and that is key to understanding the lay of the land, especially this land, the land of politics. And our next question, we want our guests to share a strategy that they used, something that they hope to share with you to promote when you run into those roadblocks that get in the way of the kind of progress that you are seeking on any particular issue. And to begin that, we're going to come back to Congressman Bobby Scott.
As roadblocks, one of the first bills I introduced in the House of Delegates was the Neighborhood Assistance Act. It's a tax credit for businesses that make donations to approved projects fighting poverty, crime, promoting education. And I remember, again, it wasn't taken seriously when I first introduced it. The chair of the Finance Committee, Archie Campbell, fought it tooth and nail. And it failed the first year. First year, they defeated it. Second year, it was defeated. And third year, I finally picked off a couple of votes, got it out of committee, got it on the floor, and it passed by a pretty close vote. I remember writing one of my friends in the state Senate a little note and said, look, if you run into trouble getting the votes, here's where you can compromise on it. And I remember getting the note back from Senator Wilder saying, don't worry, we got this. and it passed. Incidentally, about 15, 20 years later, I ran into Archie Campbell at a reception, and he said, you remember that Neighborhood Assistance Act? We got groups in town just wearing it out. They got all kinds of good stuff happening because of that Neighborhood Assistance Act. So if you just keep at it, a lot of good things happen. We've had the same problem with the Youth Promise Act over about 10 years. Comprehensive approach to juvenile crime, prevention, early intervention, rehabilitation, evidence-based approach where you can actually reduce crime and save money. Most are choosing just to do the rhetorical thing. We were able, after about 8 years, to get that as part, that was when I became ranking member of the Education Committee. Seniority has its powers. We just stuck it in the reauthorization of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, and we're in the process of getting that funded so that it can actually do the job it's designed to do.
And that's the behind the scenes that you now know. These are part of the strategies that sometimes actually ambush you, and then you try to find your way in them, through them, and around them. And you're not able always to share that story with everyone. So we're continuing with the strategies that our esteemed panel has used with Lieutenant Governor Janine Hampton. Janine?
Well, I always start from the premise that there's always a way to get something done, and that might be my engineering training. I'm an industrial engineer by training, which is process improvement. So you're always about teams and consensus and just finding a way to work together. And so I have learned, probably since I was a kid, to just not listen to naysayers. Congressman Scott mentioned not knowing that he was not supposed to win, and I've heard a lot of people who want to run for office, and they'll say, well, you know, we can't win, or they'll say about someone, you can't win, there's no way. I will tell you, if you want to ever run for office, don't pay attention to naysayers. Start from the premise that you can do it, and then find a way to make it happen. Find a way, and even if you don't win then, if it's a 2-year cycle, you've set yourself up beautifully for the next cycle. But I typically, in this job, any roadblocks that I find, I just find a way. I hear the person out who tells me what I can't do, and then I don't pay attention to them.
Thank you very much. Great strategy. You know, sometimes these stories can be, you know, a little embarrassing too, because maybe you have to educate yourself about something you didn't know before, okay? We all don't know everything, do we? Anyway, and continuing to better understand, you know, how you got around difficulties and the strategies you came up for solving a problem. Former state senator and former mayor, Howard Lee, please.
First of all, in politics, it's smart to have no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And I began understanding early on that if you go and ask people to help you achieve something in the political arena, you have to carry something that piques their interest. I'm a social worker. And so in order to help people experience change, you have to start where the mindset of the person is. So I've always used that ploy. I don't start with labels. I dismiss labels altogether. I don't care whether the person is Republican, Democrat, Independent. I believe that there's the possibility of gaining the kind of support one needs in order to achieve outcome. And anything I've done in the state Senate, and even as mayor, I was able to carry out a process in that regard. So don't let your own personal prejudice involve your, deny your ability to reach across and get people engaged to carry out those kinds of processes that you'd like to achieve as a part of the outcome. If you start with that, you're way ahead of the game and certainly have a greater chance of ultimate success.
Thank you. The same situation we're talking about here can sometimes reveal to you those avenues that you might take, and then you discover how good you're really at it. We are very interested in your story, State Senator and former Mayor Mamie Locke.
I recall that my first year as a state senator, there was a piece of legislation that a very powerful state senator had proposed. And I was told that as a freshman senator, I was to be seen and not heard, and that I was not to speak on this piece of legislation. But I was opposed to this legislation. And so I thought about it, I thought about it, I thought about it. And so for days, and I knew that this legislation was coming to the floor. And so I wrote up my speech and decided, you know, up until that very moment as to whether or not I was going to speak on that legislation. And so I said to myself, I was not elected to sit here and not speak on it, because I figured that my constituents did not want this legislation. So I spoke from a personal perspective on the legislation as to why I thought it was a piece of bad legislation, despite the fact that this was a powerful senator, and he was. And I spoke from the perspective of why I thought that it was not a good idea, why I thought it was bad for Virginia, and why I thought that it would be bad moving forward. And it was a voice vote. And so, and at the time, Tim Kaine was lieutenant governor. And so, and if people wanted a recorded vote, they would raise their hands. So I could see the majority leader saying to him, no recorded vote on this legislation, because no, we don't want to go on the board on this legislation. And so it went down on a voice vote. And so that senator came over to me and said, I will not be bringing this back next year.
Wow. Wow. Thank you very much. And Governor Wilder, I'm just going to preview. It's the same question that goes to you, but I'm also going to let you know that I'm going to be coming straight back at you again with a new question, okay? Okay, I know you can handle it.
Thank you. Bobby Scott used to come to me in the Senate, and we would be comparing things, and he would say, I don't understand why people are coming asking you about this bill, that bill, and the other. You're going to vote for it, aren't you? I said, I haven't said that. And he came to understand what I meant by that. Because I found out when I got into the Senate, being the only person of color, that, and I was green, as I told you, green as an oyster. I had a desk mate who sat beside me, Bill Rawlings from Ivor, and he would say, look, and we were good friends. He said, you can't vote for this piece of legislation that's coming up here. And I said, what's wrong with it? He said, well, you don't know what's wrong with it. I do. I'm going to vote for it, but don't you vote for it. And he explained to me the differences between and or in legislation. He explained the differences to me between shall and may in legislation. So I became pretty good at killing legislation. And I became good at being able to take the floor and speak on it to such an extent that the people would say, for God's sake, send it back to committee. That's what I wanted anyway, send it back to committee. And so I learned a great deal in doing that, because it took me 8 years to get Martin Luther King's bill passed to be a holiday in Virginia. I'd get it passed, and the governor would veto it. I'd get it passed in the Senate and the House, and another governor would veto it. I had 2 gubernatorial vetoes. And yet we still were able to get that bill passed before the federal government had a holiday for Martin Luther King. And guess what? Many of the people who voted against it came to be sponsors of the bill, because, as they said, we need time to educate our people as to what we're doing. And so I learned the hard way, but sometimes when you show that you have the authority one way, they'll respect you in terms of having it another way. Could I kill bills? Yes. I can pass them too.
Thank you very much, Governor. And I'm coming right back to you because, this next question, and again, 3 minutes, you're in a position to know things we don't know, especially if there are important issues that are being developed in some of those, committee meetings that, let's just say, the logs aren't kept, okay? And here is your time for recruiting. You have a room of people who are already on board with public service, but we need to recruit some new minds and to spread the word for those who now need to know what is in the future. My question is, what forecast would you give right now to recruit those who need to go into public service? And after you answer in 3 minutes, I want the next person.
Why they keep reminding me of 3 minutes?
The next person to.
I can cut it to make it 1 minute if you want.
No, the next person to just raise their hand when you're ready to give an answer. But this is what the question is. It is about the forecast that you can give and the recruiting message that you have. You got it.
Well, I wouldn't recruit anybody. Because if they don't want to run, they shouldn't. And if they don't feel it, they shouldn't. And if they feel that someone has to ask them to do it, that means that someone is asking them to do something they don't want to do. If you want to do it, do it. If you don't want to do it, don't do it. But if you're going to do it, you need to understand what you're going to be doing. If you're going to be dealing in politics and government, you need to know something about money. If you know nothing about money, then you're in the wrong game. And to the extent that I say that, I didn't serve on the finance committee, but my colleague from Richmond chaired the finance committee, and I was in his office every day. I knew what I needed to know about the budget. I was pleased the other day to read this week, Governor Northam announced that I think the budget is $1.6 billion in the reserve fund. Is that right, Lieutenant? You know who created the reserve fund? I did. I did. When they asked me to raise taxes as governor, I didn't. I said, I'm going to take $200 million and put it into a reserve fund, and then I'm going to take that and put it into the state constitution. It can't be changed. So Virginia will never go broke. So I would advise anyone who's interested in government, whether it's state, local, or whatever, know something about money. And never forget the people, because the people are always ahead of the others.
Thank you very much. Who would like to go next?
I agree with the governor. This business is not for the faint of heart, and because it will crush you if you do not go out there understanding what it is that you're getting into. It is a dirty business. It is a nasty business. And it is a business that will take you down if you are not truly in it, understanding what you're getting into. And you certainly do have to understand the financial part of it. Part of my responsibility as the chair of the Senate Democratic Caucus is to raise money. And it is hard to get on the phone asking people for money because they will tell you no. And it is hard to take the no answer. And it is hard to keep calling people back over and over and over again and hearing them say to you, didn't you just call me? I will call you back, and they don't. And it's hard for, when someone says to you that you have to raise, so many thousands of dollars with 6 zeros after it, to run for an office that doesn't pay you a whole lot of money. So it's not for the faint of heart. So, but let me end with this. We need you to, because we need good people in public service. And we need good people who understand the business of public service, not just to have the honorable in front of your name.
I would suggest that maybe the smartest move is not to consider running for elected office right out of the gate. There are multiple ways in which one can engage in public service, and many of those opportunities are at home, and many of them don't cost anything to perform. What about serving on a local school board and being able to make policies that influence education? What about volunteering to be on an advisory board that help elected officials understand what needs to be considered and how to implement those ideas that they have? What about running for a seat on the county commissioners or the county board or the local board? Those are not very expensive offices for which one has to run. So I would suggest that for young people, and I'm meeting with young people consistently meeting with young people on a consistent basis, and I'm saying, you're never too young to start engaging in public service, and that public service could also begin with working in a campaign on behalf of another individual. Those are multiple ways in which one gets prepared. I started by volunteering as a member of the Citizens Advisory Council. And then I started attending council meetings just to hear and understand what people were doing and how they did it. So I'm encouraging young people to recognize that either you're going to be involved in helping to protect your future by recognizing how things are changing, and also recognizing that if you're not on the front line of the battle, you have no chance of defending yourself against the attacks that are coming. And so find multiple ways to serve and engage, and don't find excuses of why you can't do it because you either don't have the time or you don't have the money to do it. That's my advice to those of you who may be considering that you'd like to be involved.
So I'm going to piggyback on that. So, you know, I meet a lot of good people who have some great ideas, and I think all of you in the room may know some people who you think would make a great mayor, councilman, whatever. But the truth is, a lot of good people don't want to get into this game because, as you said, Madam Senator, this is a nasty game. It is a nasty game. But that said, I would encourage you to jump in, but come with the right motive. Come with a servant's heart. And be grounded. I am grounded in my faith. And in fact, despite some turmoil, my faith is deeper than ever, and I will not be ground underfoot by the end of my term. In fact, I'll be standing up here, up higher than I was. And you're absolutely right. There are so many levels where you can choose to serve. I started attending, as part of my Tea Party activity, the school board meetings, the council meetings, just a number of meetings. And you know what? There were no citizens there. Nobody goes there. And they're making decisions. And I have truly learned that government the decisions goes to those who show up. So one of the things that I did was take a course that was offered. It was relatively cheap, and it was Campaign 101. I just wanted to know how a campaign worked, and that gave me some insight on at least where to start. And so when I did decide to run for office, I had a clue where to start. But I think if you come with a servant's heart, you'll come with I think you'll be okay. You really will be okay. You will meet a ton of people. You will find some way to be an asset to your community one way or another. But I would just urge you to please jump in, because we just need more regular people at the helm making decisions.
Thank you. And?
Politics doesn't have to be mean. The problem with politics and the meanness comes in when people start losing their focus on the issues. And that is really the real challenge, because the people are getting all into the spectacle of politics, and you see this a lot on the federal level, probably a lot more. I've visited the General Assembly from time to time, and it's just remarkable how dignified it is compared to what I'm dealing with. But if you focus on the issues and comment on what Mayor Lee said, no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just issues. And if you focus on the issues and meet people where they are, you can make your arguments. I was very much involved in maternal and child health when I was in the House and Senate. And when you argue with people, you have to have a different argument depending on who you're talking to. Some people, if you just say it helps the children, okay, they're all right. It helps women, they're all right. It's good for health care, well, they like health care, they're all right. Most of them, though, are persuaded by if you provide prenatal care, you'll save money. And just take an economic issue to it. It's the same argument I make a lot in criminal justice. If you put money in prevention, early intervention, rehabilitation, you'll save a lot more money than you spend. We're spending so much money in incarceration today that recent studies have shown that the incarceration rate is actually counterproductive. You're wasting so much money that could have been put somewhere else. And if you make the money argument, we had another issue on recently pensions. There are about over a million people in pension funds, and they call them multi-employer pension funds, that are about to fail. We calculated that the cost of failure between people not getting a pension, paying less tax, using more food stamps, and Medicaid, that the cost in businesses going under because they're trying to pay all the bills they can't pay and they go bankrupt, the cost to the federal budget of doing nothing is more, a lot more, about 3 or 4 times more than some of the solutions that can solve the problem. Now, I don't care if you don't care about the people's pensions, you don't care about anything else, you ought to care about the economic arguments. And we're making that to try to save these pensions. And let me just say one word. Doug did not, I don't think, really described when he said he hadn't announced how he was going to vote on a bill. I served with him on the Transportation Committee. And he came to me one day and said, "How are you going to vote on this bill?" I looked. I said, "What's this? I mean, it's nothing. It's out southwest. I don't care." He said, "Well, don't announce how you're going to vote." I said, "All right." Votes started taking place, and Doug gave me the thumbs up. Now, I didn't care about this bill. It was southwest. It didn't matter to me. We both voted yes. It came out 8-7, and subsequently passed and became law. Had we voted the other way, it would have lost 8-7, or 9-6, or whatever. Our votes passed the bill. Now, you have never seen a more appreciative member of the Senate. That turned out to be life and death issue to him. It was a project he'd been working on for years. And every day he came to me and asked me what he could do for me, and I said, "Well, you can vote on this bill. You can vote on this bill." He was coming back, and Doug had an idea of figuring out when he was going to be the key vote, and he milked that thing.
Strategy at work.
I learned a lot of skullduggery from Doug Wilder when I was in the state senate.
Thank you very much. Our last question is...
Madam Moderator, could I just make one quick point?
Yes.
And the reason I want to do this is that I have a lot of intellectual interludes, and if I don't do it, I'll forget it. I know that there are a lot of young people in this room, and it's unfortunate that we don't encourage our young people to engage in civic activities at an early age. And I really want to say to the young people, this is your life that we older people sitting on this stage are determining. You're going to have to live with the policies that we make, but you need to start learning early. You go to schools and don't go to the school board meetings, and then you end up with policies that interfere with your ability to even have a decent access to education. So I want to encourage the young people, and I'm so impressed with the Cities United. I'd not heard of it until I got here. This is an impressive organization. And the young people whom I've encountered in the hotel are just as respectful and as solid as you can be, and I'm absolutely convinced that this is the kind of leadership we should be grooming, and I want to encourage you young people to get off the cell phones, get off the TVs, get yourselves engaged in what's happening and decisions that are being made by us old politicians.
This is a good question that has obviously come from the audience because we did ask earlier for folks to put forth questions. And the question that I'm posing, and raise your hand, the first one who would like to respond to it. This question basically says, often many black political leaders and figures utilize the catch-all term minorities when discussing policy. However, blacks, undeniable, have had a very unique and peculiar history in this nation. Are black leaders afraid to advocate for policies that are geared toward black people specifically? Senator Lee.
I don't know why you're going to do that. Because policies that are made affect all of us in different ways. And we can make adjustments as we implement those policies, but I think it would be a terrible mistake for any politician, at least from my perspective, to start advocating for specific responses to specific groups based on law. And we are making law in politics. And everybody should be accountable to the same law. And so I don't think it's disingenuous to advocate for fairness and equitable and fight for, but I think the most important thing is to make sure that everybody has access to be able to have their grievances heard, to engage in the process, and to be able to get responses to their needs. And if we break down the barrier and give people freedom of choice of what they want to do and how they want to do it, to me, that is the most important thing.
I will give another minute for any other responses.
Yeah, I agree with that. One of the problems, you have a legal problem, first of all, if you have a program just for African Americans. We have problems enough with the Supreme Court with a voluntary affirmative action. If you have a racial specific program, it will probably get tossed up in the Supreme Court. But if you're trying to solve a problem of wage inequality, then we know that there are a lot of things you can do, like the minimum wage. It doesn't have to be a minimum wage for black people, minimum wage for everybody. If there's an educational disparity, you need Pell Grants for everybody, not just for African Americans. You need student loans that can, and repayment plans where people can actually repay the student loans for everybody. And I think to the extent that everybody is included, you don't have the legal problems, and you have a heck of a lot better chance of getting it passed in a legislature where at best 85% of the legislators are not African American.
Next.
One of the first questions I was asked when I was running for this office was, what will you do to help black people in Kentucky? And my answer to that is that the policies that we propose for Kentucky help all Kentuckians. You know, out of the top 100 poorest counties in the nation, 10 of them are in Kentucky, and most of those are not black counties. They're not. We've got a poverty problem, but it's not necessarily a minority problem. We've got some issues in the schools. It's not a minority problem, it's a school problem. And so the way I approach problems, I'm not looking at skin color. I'm old enough to remember Dr. King when he was alive, and he talked about judging. He wanted his kids to be judged based on the content of their character and not the color of their skin. I took that to heart as a kid. And I just see people. And so we got people issues in Kentucky. And so I figured we help Kentuckians, then by definition, we're helping minority communities too. So my focus, that's not how I approach problems. So am I afraid? I'm not afraid of nothing. I'm from Detroit, so I'm just letting you know that. And I've been harassed by the best, and they don't faze me. So I bring a measured approach to this job, but I've tried not to. It's not skin color based. It's not.
I have to tell you that there is a way to approach it, and this is how I approached it when I became mayor of Chapel Hill. I was asked the same question. What are you going to do for the black folk when you get elected? My response was nothing. But I can tell you what I am going to do. I am going to make a priority to respond to the greatest needs in this community. And I'm going to start with giving attention to those first. It wasn't my fault that the previous administration hadn't paved roads in the black community. It wasn't my fault that they hadn't extended water and sewage into the black community. It wasn't my fault that they hadn't built public housing for people who needed it in Chapel Hill. And it wasn't my fault that most of those folk who would benefit from that were black folk. And so I simply said, what I'm going to do is respond to priorities that exist in this community, and I did that. I paved the streets, extended water and sewer, built more public housing in the first year than had ever been built in the community, and I can go on and on and on. But nobody ever criticized me for being racial preferenced, and it stood. So that's the way you do it.
Any other responses before we go to this last question? Go ahead.
When we focus on issues like suspension rates or evictions or poverty or expulsions in education, you know, it isn't necessarily, you know, we're doing this for African American people. but we look at who's disproportionately affected by these issues, then, that's who we're helping.
The last question that we have is actually from where you sit again. We know that you have a view of what may be down the road, and this is a chance to forecast that. And you have in many ways given us something to look forward to. And as we also give you an opportunity to give us your final word, something that you would like to leave us with. It's of your choosing, your subject, your emphasis, and also looking out to this audience who are in position to spread the word and to take up the issues that you are presenting and to better understand a reason to keep an eye on where you're going in this next year, this century that we're in, going into 2020. And anyone who chooses can just go ahead and start.
Looks like I'm the only brave soul up here. My problem is, Doug, I can't stop talking either, so you and I are in the same boat. Most recently, I had an interview, and I was asked by a reporter, how do you want to be remembered, and what do you see coming down the road in the future? And when my life ends, I'd like to be remembered as someone who was a pioneer, who saw things that didn't exist and worked hard to improve opportunities for people. But my emphasis is on education. I think the most important thing, most important legacy we can leave for our younger people is to make sure they get access to and engage in obtaining a decent education, because educated people can fend for themselves and can succeed and to go forward. I am really concerned, and I'm really concerned because one of the most important institutions that has put many of us here, certainly me, has been black colleges and universities. And I'm watching those black colleges and universities. I'm from North Carolina, and we're having the same struggle as people are everywhere. If we lose the black colleges and universities, we are not going to be on equal footing and equal ground going forward. And so I want to say, going forward, that one of the areas we should always keep on the front burner with politicians, with decision makers, and with leaders is that they will do everything possible to make sure that these schools get adequate support and that we keep them viable, because out of these schools, even today, are coming some of our most strong and effective public servants. So I'm trying to make this quick, but that's my last word and testament.
Last word, Madam Locke.
I always like to tell this story, and I take it from a speech that Dr. Martin Luther King gave just 4 days before his assassination in 1968. And he gave this speech in Washington, D.C., and he told the story, and most of us know the story of Rip Van Winkle, and how he went up the mountain, and when he went up this mountain, he saw this picture of King George III. He slept for 20 years. When he came down the mountain, there was a picture of George Washington. And in 20 years, he had slept through a revolution. And in this speech, Dr. King said that all too often, we find ourselves going through periods of great social and political change. But too many of us don't find ourselves getting the tools necessary to equip ourselves to deal with that great social and political change. We find ourselves sleeping through a revolution. And people, we are in this period of great social and political change, but too many of us are sleeping through this revolution. And we're not equipping ourselves to deal with this revolution. So my message to you today is we need to stay woke.
Who would like to go next?
You know, when I was at the cemetery this morning, at the Tucker Cemetery, which was very moving, I was reminded of how when I was a kid, when I learned about the slave trade in history class. And I remember, I still remember, how, you talk about, we talked about at dinner the other night, events in your life that have an impact on you. And when I read about the slave trade, I decided at that point that, knowing that somewhere back in my family tree, I probably have ancestors who were not allowed to be a family. And I decided if I ever had a family, I was going to take care of my family. Knowing that at one point it was illegal to teach black people to read and write, there was no way I was dropping out of school. There was absolutely no way I was going to do that. And so moving forward, I just grew up with a sense that I belong at the table. You know, when we talk about we the people, that's me. That's you all, but that's me. And so I still meet too many people to this day, not just in the minority community, but all across Kentucky, and they don't feel like they have a voice, they don't feel like they have a say, they don't feel like they're even allowed, and I put that in air quotes, to get involved. And so my lesson, if you don't remember anything else I say, is that you all belong at the table. And let's act like we belong at the table. Governor Wilder, I love that you did not ask permission to do anything. We don't need permission. We already have permission. God made us who we are. We are each wonderful individuals, gifted and talented. I tell this to kids all the time. And just carry yourself in a manner that would make your ancestors proud, because they're right here. They are right here behind us, and I stand on their shoulders. So make them proud.
Yeah, I would think that it's been a very fine program here, and listening to my colleagues, it's been very, very refreshing. But if we look back and think about why we're here to talk about 1619 and where we've been for the 400 years. When we had no representation at all, we had strong communities. When we had not a single person elected to the legislature, we had strong communities. We had fraternities and sororities that insisted that we would vote for something. And so now we have more elected officials than we've ever had. Some you don't know that they are representing you because you never hear from them. You never know that they are there until election time. There's not a person in this room who would not understand that no Democrat can be elected in November unless there is massive, strong support in the Negro, African American, black community. Who disagrees with that? Now, if you know that, and if I know that, then what in the hell are you going to do for me to make that take place? And even after it takes place, what are you going to do for me? Do I have to continue to say, look, we're moving on, we're doing better, good, better, best, never rest until your good is better and your better best. And I'm saying to you, we need to demand what is right and to criticize what is wrong, and we should not care who those demands are made of. We've got to do it. We can do it. Learn from what our forebears told us. Stick together. Don't criticize yet until such time as you've done everything you can do, and we can do a better job than we're doing.
Can we thank our panel? Really let them know the value of the information you just heard and the marching orders that have just been delivered and the history that has been made and is continuing. And I would just ask very quickly, are there any museum owners, directors, or librarians in the room? Yeah, I see a hand here. Anybody else? Thank you for being there, continuing to tell the history. And just a reminder to support that which would tell the history accurately. One more hand for our esteemed panel.